Amy Board and I are now joined by my blood brother from across the pond and the only person I know who I can call an ethicist, Rich Gorman. Welcome back to BloodStream. Thanks for being with us.
It's great to be here, and thank you once again for having me, even though I'm all the way from the other side of the Atlantic.
Technology is an amazing thing, isn't it? To just get right into it with you, Rich, listeners may recall Rich, along with colleagues Lawrence and Dakota, joined Amy and I some months back. I don't know now, maybe over a year ago. I don't even remember. A paper that they had worked on as people with hemophilia who also had professional roles in healthcare delivery from different perspectives, all contributing to the idea of informed consent and how are we defining informed consent as it relates to gene therapy, where are some of the nuances and idiosyncrasies. And as Amy and I were talking about bringing you back on, Rich, the reason is quite a simple one. When last we spoke to you, gene therapy was an investigational therapy. It was in clinical trials. It is now commercially available in numerous places. And we have Heme A, Heme B. There are differences. The differences matter. So we've now entered into what we were anticipating last we spoke to you. So the umbrella for today's conversation, Rich, is what's changed. What's changed in your mind? What's changed from things you've heard from people? How have the ethics around gene therapy, informed consent changed, if at all, since last we spoke to you? And the floor is yours to kick us off.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, as a technology, I think it's really fast moving. It has now come into these kind of clinical spaces, and that's a very different space and a relationship between providers and people with haemophilia than in that kind of clinical trial context where a lot of the thinking and practice has developed so far. So suddenly being in that much more clinical space, you've got kind of different kinds of patients now suddenly eligible for these new technologies. So it's very different. Your clinical trials, they're often very particular about who's eligible to take part in those trials because they're trying to control for so many things.
Inclusion, exclusion criteria, is that the language that's usually associated with that?
Yeah. And you want people that are going to be good candidates for that kind of trial because it's about generating data and ensuring that there is scientific knowledge about what's going on with all this. Obviously, when you're taking it into a much more clinical perspective, then you're kind of opening up the doors for anyone, and obviously that's great, but it's a very different set of ethical considerations. And I don't know really if there's been lots of discussion around informed consent. Obviously, Lawrence, Dakota, and I have been kind of banging this gong of consent for a few years now, but I still think there's a lot more work to be done. You've now got this kind of treatment on the cards for people that might not be as familiar with it. Obviously, if you're kind of going into a clinical trial, you're going to maybe be a bit more familiar with what's going on in the kind of treatment development context. Knowing about these kind of gene therapies that are coming through, whereas now actually it's just out there as something that is available to a lot more people,
which makes me nervous. Like, listening to you say that, it makes me nervous if I'm being truthful. Like, I know it's exciting and there's a lot of good, but I get nervous. What comes up for you as you sit with that reality as a patient?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So wearing my haemophilia hat, which I mean, it'd be cool if I did have a haemophilia hat, but
we can make merch.
Yes. I mean, I think the priority has got to be education, and that needs to come from the advocacy organisations, the patient organisations, and ensuring that as a community, we are doing our utmost to make sure that other people in the community know about these new treatments that are coming into centres, into clinics, but also to try and empower people to ask questions. And when you've got sort of uncertain technologies, you need to really have mechanisms that can support really kind of open and frank and honest discussion between patients and providers. And obviously that's really hard because these are really complex technologies. I mean, I researched some of this, and I couldn't explain how gene therapies work. I mean, you've made God knows how many podcasts about this, and maybe I can turn the tables and ask you to explain to me how gene therapies work, Patrick.
Whoa, Rich! No, you got to get your own podcast first. Hold on. No, you tell us what gene therapy means. No, you make a great point, though. You make a great point. I guess there's to follow up though on this education piece. It's difficult for even people like you and I who are vested in healthcare in a way that's different than, we'll say, your quote average patient or average caregiver. And we would struggle to effectively describe the mechanisms of AAV gene therapy. And to your point, there's just the known unknowns. Like, we don't know what real world lived experience and data looks like X number of years out for this product, Y number of years out for this product. So from an ethical perspective, there is only so much education that's even available because the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns exist too. So how do we help people get what's enough knowledge? When is someone literate enough to be able to make a, quote, fully informed decision in the context of a shared decision-making process? From an ethical perspective, when is there enough education?
Yeah, I don't want to speak for ethicists everywhere.
Fair.
But I think that comes down to it's an individual thing about people feeling that they have had the opportunity to ask, that there has been sort of a sort of level of openness and transparency in discussions. So these ideas of kind of treatment remorse, that people might regret adopting gene therapy, or having a course of gene therapy, that's something that people need to be prepared for, because it's not like, say, a extended half-life product or some of these other products that are coming to market where if you're not happy with it, if you're not enjoying it, you can go back to your previous treatment.
Right.
Gene therapy is not as easy like that. So making people aware of some of these kind of just the very different mechanisms of treatment, particularly as a community where we're very used to kind of factor-based therapies.
Sure.
And how those work, and that's great. And I think all the work that's been done in the community to make sure that people are really comfortable and confident, but gene therapy is just a completely different animal.
Rich, what now, since gene therapy has been approved in several places, what have your impressions been of the provider community and the physician community? I'm sure you've heard a lot of people speak about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really varied geographically. I think certain sort of countries and advocacy groups and providers are sort of a lot more advanced in thinking about this and preparing their kind of communities for this kind of oncoming set of therapeutic technologies. And it sounds like a bit of a cop-out answer, but really I think dialogue and discussion is the sort of hallmark of really getting to the sort of important questions. There's so much that is kind of complicated in these technologies, and just assuming that people will understand it, that people have been following the kind of biotech press releases, been following the kind of regulatory announcements. That's really important. And then I guess the other part that I think for me is really important is language, and the language that we use to talk about these treatments. I mean, here in the UK, a few months ago, the BBC, a sort of major news provider over here, you had the headline of "Cure for Haemophilia." Mm-hmm. And that kind of language of cure, I think, is really problematic in terms of the kind of imaginations and promises that it's creating amongst our communities, but also not just our communities, amongst wider society. And that's one of the huge, I think, ethical considerations about gene therapies is, could the widespread use of gene therapy make society less accepting of people who are different? And then you go into other ethical considerations. if the idea that people with haemophilia have something wrong with them that needs to be corrected, and that kind of language. And then you have questions of what happens to people who perhaps don't want to have gene therapy. What support is left for them? What understanding is left by wider society when actually the headlines are bouncing around saying, hey, haemophilia's been cured. What's wrong with you? And then even if I did have gene therapy tomorrow, my ankles are still completely knackered. So yeah, the kind of language that we use, that kind of wider media providers use, and that providers themselves use to talk about these technologies is really important. And I think what's quite, it's going back to your question eventually, Amy, I am getting there with my rambling, is the providers kind of perhaps being aware of the media ecosystem which patients might be coming to them from, and that patients might be consuming this kind of media that is saying, hey, your haemophilia is cured now, great stuff. And actually, as patients, it's not our job, although some of us it is, to follow these kind of regulatory press releases and get really excited following gene therapy through all these kind of processes and approvals. Some people aren't going to be doing that. They're just going to see those sort of base media headlines. And so I think being aware that there are different levels of excitement about gene therapy perhaps is an important lesson for providers.
There's so much in what you just said. And I will respond. Well, I want to add a complication too by the usage of the word cure, which I align with you, I think is problematic. There's also...
It shows up way more than I would ever expect.
Same. And
I don't know anything of anything, Rich. And I'm like, really? People still say that word.
Yeah, people, highly credible people who I would prefer not. And yet, if they are themselves sharing the paraphrased words of their patients and trying to describe to others what patients are using, the vocabulary that patients are using to describe their lived experience, it's hard for me to fault someone for wanting to share with that level of specificity. But this particular word carries so much. And to your point, Rich, if you and I today received gene therapy, our ankles would be knackered. And thank you for bringing, speaking of vocab, and our daughters would be obligate carriers at a minimum. So how cured is this exactly? This is a problematic word. And if hemophilia cured is in headlines, and then you're going to school and you're like, I need an individualized education plan for my child with hemophilia. And they're going, no, you don't. Hemophilia is cured. It's like measles. Just get a shot or something. So there's so many problematic wrinkles to the usage of the word that we're probably best just to move on, because we could spend the rest of our time and maybe we do need a whole episode on the word cure itself. I think I'm ready for it, Amy. I don't know. I think we need to have that episode. And cool. I think I know who some of the guests are. But I want to switch gears a little bit, Rich, if we could, to another element of gene therapy in particular, where for me, ethics come into play, and that is the registries. So on one hand, we talked earlier about a lack of real-world data and how individualized these experiences are. And yet, on the other hand, the registries are what, over time, put all of the individual experiences into one collected place so that we can analyze them and, based on that analysis, learn certain trends, community population level trends. Oh, factor 8 levels are really falling off between years 7 and 8, or whatever it is that we will come to learn. So there's a lot of good with the registries. I understand it. It's great that the WFH is in a lead position. And here in the US, we have Athens, highly credible place to be the entity to provide the data to Athens on a global level. My question is, where do the ethical flags for you get raised? Because with all this data being collected and stored somewhere, and if you ask anybody, okay, well, who's looking at it and for what purposes? In my experience, the answers are some version of, well, credible scientists, and they can apply to use it. It will be de-identified. Okay, but that's pretty broad still. And so for me, I'm willing to, what's the word? I'm willing to submit to science and to the process and to the fact that I don't know how all of my data is going to be used if I go forward with gene therapy and that data is collected. I don't know, and I've decided I'm okay with it. But that's me. As an ethicist, how do you think about that piece of the pie?
So, I mean, it goes back to an ethicist's favorite word of consent. It needs to be those procedures of informed consent, that people understand what is their data is going to be used for, and and actually participation in the registry is different to perhaps participation and access to medicine. Are those two mutually exclusive? If you don't participate in the registry, then what happens? Are you still eligible for these kind of new cool novel treatments?
Right.
Because that then becomes are people really consenting to be in that registry, or is there a kind of power dynamic involved there? As their doctor
they
told
want
them,
access and have to do it.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got things like that. And what's it going to be used for? Who gets to decide what it's used for? And you see some registries for other conditions, for other sorts of biomedical data, where actually having people from the community as a sort of co-involved panel that get to sort of comment on or feedback on applications to those registries. And I think there's definitely more space in haemophilia for that kind of in the UK we call it patient involvement, where actually it's co-developed with people with haemophilia to say, actually this scientist and this group of scientists have applied to the registry. We think this is a really cool study that will benefit our community, versus, hey, this just looks like a scientist that wants to write a paper.
Rich, on a personal level, how have the last few months impacted your thinking about gene therapy in your potential future? If you feel comfortable sharing that, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit.
Yeah, dang.
Yeah, no. It's an interesting question. I'm still highly ambivalent, gene therapy agnostic. One could say, like, I know it's out there. But what power it has for me, I'm not entirely sure right now. As we were saying earlier, I could have gene therapy tomorrow, but my ankle's still in a terrible state, and that's not gonna fix that. So actually, the aspects of my haemophilia that gene therapy could contribute to on the bits that sort of bother me. So it's, I guess for me personally, it hasn't been a priority as something to sort of get too excited about. I mean, as an academic that's interested in all of this, it's fascinating. And I'm really interested in how we as a community begin to sort of make sense of this as gene therapy comes into the clinic.
Rich, as we kind of wind down, patients or caretakers, parents that are listening that might be thinking about this, are questioning, wondering if they should talk to their doctor, wondering if their hematologist is the right hematologist. What are some of your words for them as they are embarking kind of on the decision-making process? And to, what are some red flags maybe in a conversation for them to be aware of?
I mean, I think 100% people should be talking to their clinicians and providers about it, because I think it's really helpful to understand how sort of on the money your provider might be about these kind of recent changes, and kind of where they sit in terms of being sort of up to date with the science and the regulation and what's happening. I mean, I think it's really interesting to ask what they think about the treatments, and to sort of see if it kind of relates to their own research interests. That's always something that I think is really important to do, because we know, and it's really great that this happens, but a lot of haemophilia providers are also research active, and I think that's great because it means we do get research led treatment. But I think it's really important to understand is your clinician someone that is really involved in this kind of gene therapy research? Are they going to have a kind of heightened excitement over it, or perhaps the opposite? Perhaps they're kind of really interested in pursuing other lines of therapy, and as a result, they might think, no, it's not as good. So I think you're trying to find the opportunity to identify other people to talk to as well, whether that's within the advocacy groups or clinicians, providers, colleagues, and just finding out more about what is happening locally. But I think you beginning to have those conversations is really important. I think knowledge is power in this case, and I think the more we have conversations about this, then the better it will be. I mean, I think the other thing to sort of be aware of and remember is that perhaps providers aren't prepared to have these conversations themselves. And there's an opportunity, responsibility perhaps for the advocacy groups and the sort of networks of providers to sort of begin to think about what training needs providers might need in order to sort of have conversations with patients about gene therapies, but also be prepared for perhaps some of those kind of less clinical questions, more ethical questions, like, well, how does this change my identity as someone with hemophilia? I mean, it's not something.
Good luck, hematologist.
Exactly. Like, unless they've come back and done a second degree in kind of philosophy, which would be really cool, and I'd happily advocate for. It might not be the kind of question that they're prepared to or expect to answer, and they might even not assume that it's their responsibility to answer those questions. But again, as we were saying earlier, gene therapy is such a different technology, and it has kind of much more social and emotional impacts as well as clinical impacts that I think, as part of any equitable conversation, there needs to be space to ask those kind of identity-based and philosophical questions as well. And I think it's important that providers can make space or bring in colleagues with expertise to support people to explore those lines of thinking too.
Greg Blamey is a clinician at a hemophilia treatment center in Canada. We had him on BloodStream some months back to talk about sexual health in particular, and he made the point of how often sexual health just doesn't come up at all in the context of a clinic visit. And he said this in stark terms: we call this comprehensive care.
Yes.
We, the providers, we dubbed it that. So if we want to fulfill what we've called it, we have to deliver on that. And I think that means sexual health. That means, hey, gene therapy's here. We have to have conversations about ethics and identity at a level we didn't before. You're not ready for that center? That's okay. Get ready for it. No one was ready for it. And now it's here. And so now we have to just change. You have to evolve. And I do think there's a responsibility on the advocacy side of things to make sure that in addition to educating our patients, our caregivers, policymakers, that we are not just saying, oh, and here walks in the physician, everybody applaud and let them on stage and let's listen to what they have to say. Sometimes they need help too. And if we only ever ask them to be in leadership positions, we put them in a tough spot as well. If we never say to them, hey, here's some materials we wanted to make available to you. Hey, we have a session during our weekend that has, a scientist from the CDC who's particularly expert because we thought you amongst patients might enjoy some of the education. We have to think a little bit more creatively, as do the centers. Rich Gorman, blood brother from across the pond, ethicist. I appreciate you. Thanks for joining Amy and I today on BloodStream, and we will see you back again before too long.
Awesome. I look forward to continuing the conversation.